Okay. All right, so I already laid out a horizon line. I think I'm recording. And a vertical and a circle. And the circle is just the height of my paper. That's giving me my starting point. Now, like I said, a 45 degree, we're assuming that this center point is our center of vision. I think it is, CV, and I'm on a grayed out layer. And the point we're standing is the station point. And we're going to draw these measuring points. But what I said earlier is that if I draw a 45 degree angle from my corner of my station point out to where it meets my horizon line, well, that just happens to line up also with my circle. So for the other side, I actually don't even need to do that. I just know that there's my measuring point and there's my measuring point. MP, MP. All right, now I can do something also a little tricky here. I'm going to use this as a 45 degree line. Now I want my measurements along the bottom of this. So I'm measuring 1 foot increments. Now I've measured them up here. These are my 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, and this is 5 feet. So I've made my eye level at 5 feet. And I could transfer these by using this diagonal. So diagonals are good for transferring measurements in true scale, meaning they're not vanishing off in perspective right now. So I'm just going to go off and transfer all of these down. So now I'm starting to get a grid on the base here that is 1 foot each, right? If you guys look at most home tiles, they're either a foot exactly or 2 feet. So this is kind of a good thing to have an idea of what an actual foot is. And next one just happens to come over here. Now also I'm going to measure these off on the side, so I'm kind of I'm going way off the edge here for a minute. So this is going up the edge of the paper. And because I've got layers turned on, I'm going to turn some of these down a little bit so they're not so obnoxious. But you should draw all this lightly. All right, so now I'm going to start building out my perspective grid. I could do the same thing going over the other side, but I'm going to do a little shortcut here by just copying some of this. So there's 5. Is that the right layer? That's this one. Yeah, so I'm just going to, now I've got kind of a start of a grid. Just in the interest of time. Ah, copy that. Paste that. I am going to put them over here too. Paste that again. Put that over here too. So they should be technically 1 foot increments. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do, I want to draw a grid on the floor. I'm going to turn on a new layer, change my color. And so now I've got my 1 foot increments all along here. You're all with me so far? Everybody good? All right, so now I'm going to go back to my vanishing point. And like I said before, the more precise you can be about this, the better. Because if you're a little bit off, it's just going to compound as you go around. So I'm laying out a line to every one of these markers. And in a second, I'll figure out my my first depth. All right, again, I'm going to stop short here for a second, but so these should all go exactly the same. I'm kind of a little bit off. So that's, what was that? Yeah, I'll copy, I'll fill in a second. All right, so I'm going to use my measuring point on my first, anywhere on here to figure out how deep is 1 square. So now we just happen to have this 45 degree one already that goes right to here. So that's going to tell me where these cross. There's how deep the first line of squares are. Now if I go back to the next one, oops, That one's a little bit off. Now, I'm using this first diagonal that was already there, but I can use any diagonal to the same measuring point. Now, here's another question I couldn't figure out at first, but well, how do I get the rest of these green lines to go way off the edge of the board? Because I want to draw some stuff over here, and I want it on this grid, but I ran out of markers. Well, I can use the same technique. I can go this is another one of those millions of different ways to get at it. But let's draw from this measuring point down to another. Anyway, these squares. Now I could see I didn't quite line up right. Look at this intersection right there is a little screwy. And this is because I'm not exact along here. But this measuring point, because if I do this right, any of these crossings should indicate a intersection. So in this case, I'm going to go, do you see how I'm going right through this point right here on that same diagonal? And I'm going through this next one right there. And I'm going through this next one right there, just going off the edge. Now you can see I'm kind of projecting these way out into space where I don't have a true measurement anymore, but these diagonals should be helping me. Now I could do the same thing by continuing where I'm going here. So let's go back to my blue. And this. All right, so I'm going to zoom in here a little bit so we can kind of see what we're doing. So there's the next one. This lines look a little screwy, but let's go with it. Okay, so I've run out again, but I can go over to this one if I want. Oops. Go back to green. So I can go to any one. I can go to this point here, which I'm doing. And the other kind of interesting thing is that any space along these verticals, these should all be equal measurements. So technically, I could measure these and find what that spacing is along here and continue this along. All right, so what you guys are going to do is basically set up a grid on the ground. Now look what's happening to my lines. They're getting closer and closer and closer together. I'm going to get to the point where I can't even draw lines without them being stacked up on top of each other. So, you know, part of it is making sure your materials, pencils are really sharp. Back to blue. So you're drawing really fine lines. And there's a other point where it's just going to all mush together. This is that diminishing detail. So I'm going to stop here for a minute. And now let's draw some cubes in space because we're going to draw this whole environment. So let's start off. I'll just draw some, I'm going to say there's some rocks. And I'll also look at what's happening over here again. You see how these, this square right here, doesn't that look pretty distorted? That doesn't look too realistic, but look how far out of our cone of vision we are. Remember, this is the, this first cone is actually the 90-degree cone. So really we should be in at 60-ish degrees. So I'm just going to approximate this here, but you could measure. Well, here, let's do it for real. So this line will tell me it's got a little degree thing on the bottom. So I'm going to go to 60 degrees right there. And now that is much smaller than I even thought. There's my cone of non-distortion. I'd say you can go out to the 90-degree cone again, like if we kind of pick our paper somewhere in this range. That should be fine. So build up your grid thing much bigger, but let's concentrate on this little area in the center. And notice I'm kind of going almost the top and bottom of my cone of vision, but going all the way out to this 90-degree one because the paper is not square. So, as I said, this will carry on further, but in interest of time, I'll speed this up. So, once again, I'm going to kind of gray this down a little bit so you can see what I'm doing. So, I'm going to pick features that are a little bit bigger than 1 foot. Just, it doesn't matter. So, I'm going to say, let's pick a 2 foot. 2 feet will be my rocks, we'll call them. So let's pick a new color. Sorry. All right, so I'm gonna just pick arbitrarily any of these 4 squares is a 2 foot, and I'm just gonna freehand this. No, I'm not. Okay. So there's a 2 foot section on the ground plane where I'm standing. Now I want to make it 2 feet high at that point. So how do I know how high 2 feet is back here? So the same kind of idea that we use for our measuring point, a 45-degree angle in this case is going to help us a lot. So I'm going to put my 1 point there and use your 45-degree triangle. 2, 3, 4, 5. So a 45-degree angle will transfer a measurement from a horizontal to vertical or vertical to a horizontal. As long as I'm flat to this picture plane, this all works. So that tells me at this point right here, that's how high that should be. And now this is one of those points where once you have like a couple key measurements, then it's just tracing out, okay, so I've got the square, I've got vanishing points I got to go off to, and I've got this horizontal is going to go up that way, and go off this way, come from this point, whoops, sorry, back in space. And there is a cube, and I think I did this all on the same layer. Yeah, I did, but let's draw, now that we got 1 cube, so I'm going to do this in black. Because typically you want to, when you're drawing all this perspective stuff, you want to draw it as if it's glass, because these back points and things are important. But once you get it all in there, then all we need is the exterior view, which is this. So there's one of my cube rocks. Now if I want to put another one, let's say way over here, I basically do the same procedure. So ready for this? Let's do it. There's 2 feet. And how high is it? I use my 45, but in this case I'm going to cheat and use this little cuboid thing here. So there's a cube that's 2 feet wide. How deep is it? Well, I'm right on that edge, so I can't really see it, but I can see a little bit over here, so that's going to help me. So I'm going to go 2 feet back, and in this case, once again, this is the part you're not going to normally see, so I'll do it in a different color. And then from this corner back into perspective, this one back into perspective, and then where this point comes up and meets that line, that shows me how deep it is there. And so now let's transfer just the visible edges to my foreground. There's my second cube. Yeah, when you block it all out, yes, but when you ink it in, just the front views. just like I did here. So I used all that stuff to get me here, but then when I'm all said and done, I just want to ink in the parts that are visible. So is everybody so far with me? Okay, now let me just show you another trick. Let's just say, I don't even know how big this cube is. I'm just going to draw one in space. Doesn't even matter. Just one over here. If I've done shift. Okay, so this cube has no dimension. It looks like it's about the same as this. Let's go something even more radical just so. Let's do a big cube. Okay, so we got that big cube in space. So these measuring points, is this where they come in handy. So I can go either side, whichever is going to give me more help. Just trying to scoot some of these things out of the way. So I'm going to do both just so you can see. Go to my gray layer and I'll pick red. So measuring point off to this diagonal, or measuring point from here to this diagonal. All right, so that's the first part. Now I got to go back to my vanishing point and draw in all these edges going back in perspective. So theoretically, now let's choose blue. Where these cross, that's showing me the back of the line. But notice both of those cross because diagonals, they do some magical stuff. That's a little light. Can you see that? So at that point where those cross, I go up. That point where those cross, I go up. So here's the back line. So here's a much larger cube that has no particular dimension to it. So I just drew the cube, and then the measuring points help me find out what that would look like at that depth. So let me go back and ink that in. This is the part I see. And I won't see any of the rest of it because it's so big. Okay, now also keep in mind that I'm 5 feet tall. And these little cuboid things are 1 foot squares. So I want you guys to make a little house, a dwelling, a structure, something in there. So you think about that, like how big is a doorway that I got to walk through? How big is the wall or whatever? So maybe maybe the wall is 10 feet tall, and the door is going to be 8 feet tall. So that should allow me to get in there. So how can I do that? Well, I can go anywhere back here and measure along any one of these lines, or I can actually put the measurements, those foot markers, up along this edge, which I didn't do yet, but I could build out this exact same measurement on here. These are not to scale, so ignore that. And I could transfer that back, or I could take any measurement back in here. Again, we know these are 1 foot squares. So let's say my house was going to be back in here somewhere. I'm going to say this point. I'm going to draw my wall going up. So how high is 10 feet in this point in perspective? Well, I'm going to use that little trick I did to measure diagonally and count out 10 feet, right? So let's zoom in here a little bit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there's 10 feet. So again, I can transfer this up. You can also transfer with your compass. And that comes in handy sometimes too. So basically, if I put my center point there, and I measure out my compass till it's right on that line, and then I draw an arc, it should be the exact same thing as if I drew a 45-degree angle. So if you don't have your 45-degree and you just have a compass, you can transfer a lot of measurements that way. So that is 10 feet tall now in this whole scene. And then how far back or whatever, let's see, maybe the door's 3, 4 feet wide, maybe. So I can count out, and one of my little cubes is going to be in the way here, but it kind of actually, you know what, it doesn't really matter because I can do this. Whoa, sorry. So what I have so far is the height line, so my perspective is going to go like this. Now I don't have to, I could say this is the front corner, I could say it's the back corner, or maybe it's the middle of the wall. It doesn't really matter. I just need to, I've got the height now, I've transferred it up. So I'm going to go back here and start here just because my grid goes back to there. And I want to move it away from this cube. So there is the very edge of my wall. And this is also why it's handy to draw see-through, because now I can draw this. Let's say this rock is going to be sitting right at the corner of my house. I am going to draw the side here because I can see that there's the bottom, so these things are not actually colliding yet. And so how wide is this house? Let's find out. And this is, you know, I'm just designing as I'm going. So I'm going to count how many little grid spots I have along here. Got one. Here's the corner. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it looks like it's about 9 feet long. So I'm going to put in a doorway that's, I'll just say 2 feet wide. And I could count how many, what did I say was 8 feet tall? So I can use that same compass trick. I have a true measurement along this one line, doesn't matter where it is, but there's 10, 9, 8. So I'll follow that up to my black line. So that gives me an 8-foot marker, and I'm going to go back in space. I'm going to stop just in a minute here, almost done. So that point where those intersected, I come up. This is the height of any door on here. It just happens to be that this is going to be the door. So now let's ink this part in that part. Oops, sorry. You know, I didn't. That's the problem with this program. I get carried away and I start drawing on the wrong layer, and then you can't erase and turn off things, but that's fine. And then this door has some thickness, so let's call it 1 foot thick, so I can measure back there on the grid, 1 foot up, and it's going to be parallel, the top of it, and then the other top is going to go back in perspective, and I don't want that whole thing, I just want that part. So this is basically what you guys did on your walls, right? So we're building a little house, very simple house. Now this whole side of the house should be all proportional true measurements. Now that we have our scale, we got 10 feet tall, and we can measure along this line and figure out how wide it is. Put some little trim detail on the top. All right, so this is what I want you guys, let me stop this for a minute.